Chapter 12 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 12. Love, then, had hope of richer store. After that summer day under the plane trees, Sybil utters the name of Secretan no more. Hope of relenting on her uncle's part there is none. If Alexis could forgive the man who in his version of the story came basely between father and son to cheat the son of his heritage and trick the lover out of his mistress, Stephen Trenchard's stubborn soul would still remain unsoftened. Reconciliation between these two was impossible. To retain her uncle's favor and inherit a portion of his wealth, Sybil must keep the secret of her marriage. A painful part to play, even for a mind not untrained in deceit. But a necessary part, Sybil tells herself. A difficult game, but for a stake well worth the winning. She has no exact measure of her uncle's possessions. He has never talked to her of his investments or told her his income. But she has a fixed idea that his wealth is almost without limit. That, like the Rothschilds or the Duke of Westminster, he could scarcely state the sum total of his riches if he were asked for exact figures. His fortune is a rolling mass of gold, she supposes, which grows larger at every turn like a snowball. The respects he sees paid to him by the elect of Redcastle establishes her in this conviction of Stephen Trenchard's importance, for she knows that in this case importance can only mean money. Lancaster Lodge is one of those handsomely finished, solidly built houses which adorn the outskirts of every country town, and are like temples dedicated to the genius of commonplace. Houses in which the butler's pantry has been as carefully considered as the drawing-room, and in which my lady's boudoir is just as unlovely as John Thomas's attic under the Leads. All the principal rooms are large and square and lofty. The passages are broad and straight. The staircase is well proportioned, ventilated, and lighted to perfection. Impossible to find fault with a house which, as the house agent proudly puts it, possesses all the requirements for a gentleman's family. Equally impossible to feel the slightest interest in a mansion which neither awes by its splendor, nor attracts by its eccentricity, nor charms by the lowlier graces of homeliness and simplicity. A coffin descending that mathematical staircase would lose its awfulness in the pervading atmosphere of commonplace. A cradle in any of those rooms would seem to have lost its way and wandered into a desert where baby life could not endure. No sadly sweet fancies of domestic joys that are no more entwine themselves about this dwelling of Stephen Trenchard's. It looks like what it is, an old bachelor's house, and Mr. Trenchard could hardly have chosen a habitation more completely in harmony with his own character. The Redcastle upholsterer, a man whose stock in trade appears to consist of 2 easy chairs and a sideboard, but who can do great things at a push, has furnished Lancaster Lodge with appropriate splendor. All is solid and grandiose. Dark crimson draperies, velvet in the dining-room and library, satin brocade in the drawing-room, subdue the garish light and give a sombre grandeur to the rooms. Heavy oak furniture, thickest Turkey and Persian carpets, varied spoil of carved black wood, ivory, porcelain, and Bombay inlaid work which Mr. Trenchard has brought home with him from India. Everywhere the evidence of wealth. To Sibyl, the house seems simply perfect. Its luxury, its soft, silent splendor, contrast so pleasantly with the humble homeliness of her Uncle Robert's old-fashioned, low-ceiling rooms. The stealthy-footed footman, who spends so much of his time looking at nothing in particular out of the hall window, that he grows sedentary in his habits and fancies he has disease of the heart. The ponderous butler in his glossy black suit and irreproachable white tie. The smart maidservants in crisp starched cambric, tight-waisted, prim, supercilious, as if Mr. Trenchard's importance as the richest man in Redcastle shed reflected glory upon them. The household has an air of quiet dignity which impresses Sibyl wonderfully. Her soul reposes itself in this land of fatness. She looks back at her life in Dixon Street, its one room, its manifold privations, veritable starvation hovering near like the wan spectre of approaching doom, and the change seems too wonderful for anything but a dream. Does she think of the husband who shared her poverty, whom she abandoned to endure misfortune alone, deserted in the darkest hour of their wedded life? What does she not think of him? Memory and regret are interwoven with the fabric of her life. She consoles herself, justifies her desertion of Alexis by the idea that life must have been made easy to him by their separation. As a married man with a helpless wife to provide for, he was like a vessel waterlogged. Relieved of that burden, he is the same ship free to sail for any port in quest of fortune. One night, in the solitude of her prettily furnished bedroom, all rose-colored chintz and shining maple, furnished especially for a young lady's occupation at Mr. Trenchard's order, Sibyl takes out an insignificant paper-covered book from among her most sacred possessions, and opens it with a hand that trembles a little as she sits alone in the lamplight. It is like opening the grave of the past. That little sixpenny book is the diary she kept at Mrs. Hazelton's, her brief love story. Tearfully, sorrowfully, she reads that record of her first and only love. The story of a time when in singleness of mind and simplicity she surrendered her heart to its conqueror. "I love him, I love him, I love him," she reads, almost blinded by tears. She remembers the gush of passionate feeling with which those foolish words were written. "And 1 little year after I wrote that line, I deserted him," she says to herself, wondering at her own hardness of heart. "What a fool I must have been when I wrote this book." This is her verdict as she closes the volume. Yet she feels as if it were the best and brightest part of her life in which those foolish pages were written, and that she was happier in those days than she is now, although she has become a personage in Redcastle. She looks around her room wonderingly, glancing at the maple wardrobe which contains so many pretty dresses, such a treasury of ribbons and lace, and the frivolities women love. Would I exchange all this, and the hope of a fortune from my uncle, for the dismal second-floor schoolroom at Mrs. Hazelton's, and the freshness and sweetness of first love? She asks herself. And for a moment it seems to her that could a good fairy give her back the days that are no more, she would be a gainer by the exchange. If she could know that her husband was safe and well, that he had prospered since she left him, or that things had gone tolerably well with him, she might feel more at ease than she does. But she knows nothing of what has happened to him since the beginning of the year, when he was seen at Redcastle, a dismal apparition, and of this appearance of his she only hears by chance, a few days after her perusal of her diary, from no less a person than her younger sister Jane, otherwise Jenny. Sibyl is spending the day with her Uncle Robert, a visit which ranks as a condescension now that she is on intimate terms with the Stormonts, the Groshans, Dr. Mitson, and, in a word, the elite of Redcastle. She is received by her indulgent old uncle with all honour. Hester prepares an extra good dinner, a dainty little loin of veal and a curry of yesterday's roast mutton, followed by the unwonted extravagance of a tart and a pudding. Marion sees this relaxation of the economic bow with certain sniffings and bridlings indicative of suppressed indignation. "I never knew such a time-server as Hester," she remarks, as she surveys the table laid as for a feast, a clean tablecloth in the middle of the week, almonds and raisins for dessert, an altogether ruinous expenditure. "She didn't make this fuss about you when you were at home, and now she pays her court to the heiress-elect." "No more an heiress-elect than you or Jenny, I should imagine," replies Sibyl lightly. "I think it is pretty clear that Uncle Trenchard means to leave his money among us, though he has not said as much." "Yes, and the lion's share to you, no doubt, though he has known me the longest," says Marion snappishly. "A precious sight of his money I'm likely to get, when he never so much as asked me to go and see him," observes Jenny, whereupon both sisters swoop down upon her in denunciation of such a noun of quantity as a precious sight. "Where do you pick up your language, child?" cries Sibyl. "Not in the streets, surely, since Marion teaches you, and you have no occasion to be running about." "A fat lot Marion teaches me," says the incorrigible child. "She nags at me for an hour and a half by the kitchen clock every morning, and calls that education." "Pray, in what edition of Lindley Murray do you find the verb to nag?" demands Marion, with the air of a pedagogue. "It's as good a verb as any other. I nag, thou naggest, he or she nags, generally she. Or take it in Latin if you like. Nago, nagas, nagat, nagamus, nagatis, nagant. First conjugation. Perfect, nagavi." "I am afraid that Jane has rather an unruly temper," remarks Dr. Faunthorpe mildly. "Oh, of course it's Jane. Marion is never aggravating. You don't find me unruly, do you, uncle?" Jane adds coaxingly, as she sidles up to the gentle, easy-tempered little doctor, who has gone through life placidly bearing other people's burdens, and has never murmured against a destiny that has weighted him with 3 orphan nieces. Later in the afternoon, Sibyl and Jane are alone together in the garden, Marion having lost her temper at croquet and left them to themselves. The little bit of grass upon which they play is not many sizes bigger than the billiard table at Lancaster House. The balls and mallets are in the last stage of shabbiness, and chipped into icosahedrons. "You must both come to afternoon tea to-morrow, if it's fine, and play croquet on Uncle Trenchard's lawn," says Sibyl, condescendingly, as if she were inviting them to her own house. Perhaps this patronizing invitation has something to do with Marion's loss of temper 5 minutes afterwards, when Jenny sends her ball into a distant cabbage bed. The sources of bad humour are more often complex than simple. It is a warm September afternoon, one of those days in which people incline to sitting in gardens rather than walking on dusty high roads. Sibyl sits on the grass, as she was wont to do 3 years ago, before she was anybody's heiress. Jenny sprawls with an appalling display of legs and boots and rusty bootlaces at her sister's side. "Now, Sybil," she says eagerly, "tell us about the parties you go to." "Pray, who is your companion?" inquires Sybil, with a contemptuous droop of her heavy eyelids. "I see no one here but yourself." "I don't know what you mean," says Jane, staring. "No more do I, when you say tell us." "Oh, lor, as if it mattered. You are as bad as Marion. Now do be nice, Sib, for once in a way, and tell me what it's like going to the Stormonts. Only fancy you've been asked there ever so many times, and to think how often I've passed their door when we've been out for walks, and the inside of it has seemed as far off as heaven. Further, indeed, for they say we're sure to go to heaven if we're good, but we're not sure of going to the Stormonts unless we're rich. What's it like, Sib? Do tell." "Well, they live in a house, as you know, since you've seen the outside of it, and they eat their dinner at a table, just as we do, and they are rather stupid after dinner, and the ladies go up into the drawing-room and talk about other people who are not there, and a little about the minister and the clergyman and the schools, and look at one another's dresses. I can see them count the flounces of my dress sometimes, and actually take the pattern of it under my nose, which I consider an impertinence." "Is it nice going to grand dinners?" asked Jane breathlessly. "Yes, I suppose so. It's rather a mild kind of enjoyment. It doesn't quicken one's pulse by a single throb. It isn't like riding a good horse, or seeing a race, or hearing a great singer, or even getting a good break at billiards. There's no excitement, no elation. But one feels one is doing the right kind of thing, that this is what one was born for." "Are the dinners nice?" inquires Jenny, licking her lips gluttonously. "They're very grand," replies Sybil. "I don't know that I should care about vol au vent à la financière, or petit timbal du gibier for a continuance, and with so many made dishes one has the idea that one is eating up all the cold meat that has accumulated in the last week, and one gets rather tired of seeing saddle of mutton and boiled fowls everywhere, for whether you call fowls poulet à la béchamel or capons en demi d'aville, they are very much the same birds." "Capons in half mourning? That is funny. Do you know what my favorite dinner is, Sib? Bullock's heart with veal stuffing and currant jelly. Do you ever have that at Colonel Stormont's?" "You must never mention such a dish, Jenny. It's positively revolting." "But you used to like it, and liver and bacon and sheep's head with parsley and butter. But never mind your dinners. Tell me about your beau. Marion says that young Mr. Stormont was in love with her until you lured him away. Marion is a fool. You must have lots of lovers now that you go into such grand society, Sib, because you are the beauty of the family, you know. We all know that, and that's what makes Marion so cross sometimes. 'I'm nobody,' she says, and then she squeezes her waist in another half-inch and fancies she has got the better of you. She's awfully proud of her figure, you know." "You mustn't talk disrespectfully of your elder sister, Jenny," remonstrates Sybil, yawning. The plebeian 2:00 dinner and the game of croquet in the afternoon sun had made her sleepy. "Then I won't talk of her at all. Tell me about your lovers, Sib. That's a deal more interesting." "Nonsense, child. I have no lovers." "But you had one once." "Yes, I saw somebody who was in love with you once, though he must have gone down in the world dreadfully since you had had anything to say to him, for he looked little better than a beggar when I saw him." Sybil has sunk into a reclining attitude with half-closed eyes, and is dropping into a gentle doze. But at this speech of Jane's, she starts into a sitting posture again, and looks intently at her sister, very pale. "What do you mean?" she cries. "What was he like? Where did you see him? When? Tell me all about it this instant." "Ah, I see you know the person I speak of. You wouldn't be in such a way if you didn't. How pale you are, Sibyl. Do you care for him very much?" "Will you tell me what you are talking about, child?" exclaims Sibyl passionately. Jane begins her story with deliberation and importance. "I have always kept it a secret," she prefaces, "feeling that it might get you into a row with Uncle and Marion. And I've wanted to tell you about it ever since you came home, but I've never had a chance of being alone with you till this afternoon." "For goodness sake, go on. What was the man like?" "Very handsome and noble looking, though his clothes were dreadfully shabby. His coat was shabbier than Uncle's, snuff and all, but it looked as if it had been a more gentlemanly coat in its day. And as for his poor boots, it made my heart bleed to see them. I wanted to give him my new shilling, one Uncle Robert gave me on Christmas Day, for it was the day after New Year's Day that I saw the man, you know. I know nothing. Never mind how you came by the shilling." But he pushed away my hand gently and said, "No, my dear, I'm not a beggar, though I dare say I look like one." "Poor fellow," sighs Sibyl. "Oh, Sibyl, I did feel so ashamed of myself for having offered him that shilling. Ever so much ashameder than he did," adds Jenny, coining a comparative in the impetuosity of her speech. "Can't you tell me about it straight, beginning at the beginning?" demands Sibyl impatiently. "Well, it was the day after New Year's Day. I detest New Year's Day, church in the morning and dullness in the afternoon. And I came into the garden to have a run all by myself, and to get out of Marion's way. It was a little after 4, between the lights, you know, and a wretchedly cold afternoon. Well, you know the lane at the bottom of the garden?" "Of course," says Sibyl, with an involuntary glance in that direction. "Beyond the plot of lucerne there's a low wall, and on the other side of the wall an accommodation road leading to a neighbouring farm." "Well, he was there, looking over the wall, and he beckoned to me. I was afraid at first, thinking he might be a robber, but as I had nothing but my hoop to be robbed of, I went up to the wall to look at him, and then I saw, somehow in a moment, that he was a gentleman, though I'm sure you wouldn't have given tuppence for his hat." "What did he say?" "He asked me if my name was Faunthorpe, and then if I had a sister called Sibyl. 'Yes,' says I, 'but she's away in London.' 'Where?' says he. 'At Mrs. Hazelton's, Lowther Street, Eccleston Square,' says I. 'Is that all you know about her?' says he. 'What more can I know about her?' says I. 'She's very happy, I believe, and she's very well. At least she was when Uncle heard from her last.' 'When was that?' says he. 'About 3 weeks ago,' says I. And then he sighed heavily, and he looked so white and tired that I pitied him with all my heart." "Poor fellow," sighed Sibyl again. "Ah, you do know him then?" cries Jane. "How can I tell? He didn't give you his name, I suppose?" "Not a bit of it. He asked me a lot of questions about you. Did we expect you home soon? And so on. But I could tell him no more than I had told him at first. You were at Mrs. Hazelton's, and you were likely to stay there, for anything I knew. I didn't know that Uncle Robert wanted you to come home at that time. They don't take me into their confidence." "You didn't mention Uncle Trenchard?" asked Sibyl with a scared look. "Of course not. Why should I go and mention our rich uncle to a wandering tramp that might go and steal his plate? At least, I don't mean that, for when once I heard the poor thing speak, It never entered my mind that he was anything but a gentleman." "Who is he, Sibyl? Do tell me. Someone who fell in love with you in London? Saw you go by in Mrs. Hazelton's carriage, perhaps, and fell in love with you at first sight, and followed you about everywhere, and neglected his profession, and went to the dogs for your sake? Do tell me all about him." "How do I know who the man was?" said Sibyl absently. There is no shadow of doubt in her mind. This wanderer was her husband, and had come to Redcastle in quest of her. "I'll describe him if you like. I can see him before me at this moment. He is tall and dark, with rather large features, regular features, but striking. Not one of those straight-nosed, waxwork faces one sees in the hairdresser's shop. His lower lip projects a little, which gives him a rather scornful look till he smiles, and then he has the kindest expression. 'Dear child,' he said, and patted my shoulder so kindly, 'you are just a little like your sister when you look up at me as you are looking now.' You won't think that a compliment, I know, Sib, but he said it. Who is he, Sib? Do tell me." "I have not the remotest idea," replies Sibyl with provoking indifference. "Come now, you wouldn't have been so agitated when I spoke about him if you hadn't guessed who he was." "I was not agitated," says Sibyl, pretending to yawn. "Oh, very well. If you like to tell crammers, of course I can't help it. My experience of elder sisters is that they may break all the commandments with impunity and drive a coach and six through the catechism. I think they wash their hands of Christianity when they're confirmed." "Jane, you are not only blasphemous, but you're extremely impertinent to me," exclaimed Sibyl. "Well, if that's all I get for keeping your secrets." "That was wise of you, at any rate, Jenny," says Sibyl, making haste to relent. "Marion would have made no end of mischief out of nothing. Never mind the man in the lane, dear. We'll forget all about him. He was some foolish fellow, no doubt. And if you'd like a new frock for Sunday, Jenny, you shall have that pretty checked peach-coloured silk of mine, and I'll get Miss Eilert to make it up for you." "Oh, you dear!" cries Jane, crimsoning with rapture. "That lovely peach colour! How sweet I shall look if," with a doubtful look at her well-worn boots, "if Uncle Robert will only give me new boots. If he won't, I know somebody else who will. And, Jenny, if you can contrive to keep your hair a little smoother and your hands a shade cleaner, you wouldn't be the worst-looking child in Redcastle," says Sibyl, drawing her younger sister towards her, and bestowing a condescending kiss upon that young person's forehead. "Now mind, when you come to afternoon tea with me to-morrow, you make yourself look as nice as ever you can." "I'll do my best, Sib, but I know I shall feel shabby before those stuck-up servants. When is Uncle Trenchard going to have Marion to stay with him again, do you think?" "I don't know. That's a question I can't ask him, you see." "I suppose not. But Marion's rather cut up at his not inviting her, you know. I say, Sib, I fancy Marion's nose is out of joint since you've come home." Sibyl smiles, a self-satisfied smile. She is very sure of her uncle's preference, knows quite well that he considers Marion something of a simpleton, and not a little of a bore. "It isn't my fault, Jenny, if Uncle Trenchard likes me best," she says complacently. The sisters go into tea after this, Jenny with her arm around Sibyl's waist. "I say, Sib, when you're married and have a beautiful house of your own, you'll have me to stay with you sometimes, won't you? I'll be good and keep my hair tidy." "I mean never to marry, Jane. At least not during Uncle Trenchard's lifetime. I mean to keep his house for him, always." "But he may live to be 90, 20 years to come, and a nice old woman you'll be by that time. Who'd have you then?" You ought to marry now, Sib, while you have such advantages. That's what Uncle Robert says. Do be married soon, that's a dear, and let me be your bridesmaid in white muslin over pink silk. Is Frederick Stormont very nice?" "He's absolutely detestable," replies Sibyl, and immediately, without rhyme or reason, bursts into tears. She is thinking of the fond and faithful husband who came to Redcastle in quest of her, and departed hopeless. Where is he? What is he doing? How has he fared since that bleak January afternoon when he found his journey had been useless? Starving, perhaps? Or worse, dead? Slain by his own hand in some dark hour of despair? Has she not reason to fear the worst of one she left without hope? 3 days later, by the help of her old ally, Mrs. Hazelton's housemaid, Jane Diamond, Sibyl contrives to insert the following advertisement in the second column of the Times supplement. S.S. to Alexis. You are not forgotten. In all I do, I am faithful to you and your interests. I look forward to our reunion. Wait and hope as I do. Write and tell me where you are and what you are doing. Address S.S. Post Office, Hale Street, Pimlico. This advertisement is inserted 3 times, and the housemaid inquires diligently at the Hale Street Post Office during the following fortnight for a letter to be addressed to S.S. No such letter comes, and Sibyl's vague fears of evil are intensified by this ominous silence. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 13. The Sweets of Life. Not a word has been said by Mr. Trenchard as to his testamentary intentions in reference to his 3 nieces. But in the mind of Redcastle, it is an established fact that Sibyl is to inherit the bulk of her uncle's property. "The other 2 girls will get something, no doubt," Mrs. Stormont remarks obligingly to Mrs. Groshen, the banker's wife, as these 2 ladies take their afternoon tea together ceremoniously in the Stormont drawing-room, a spacious apartment with a good deal of white panelling, gold moulding, and looking-glass, and not much besides in the way of furniture. A barren tract of Brussels carpet, with an islet here and there in the shape of sofa, ottoman, or coffee-table. "The other 2 girls will get something, of course. 200 a year each, perhaps, and a very nice income, too, for young women not likely to marry. But mark my words, Mrs. Groshen, Sibyl is the heiress. Mr. Trenchard positively dotes upon her." "Do you think her pretty?" asked the banker's wife languidly. "She has been esteemed a beauty in her time, on the strength of an aquiline nose and a large pale blue eye, and she does not particularly approve of these new lights." "Well, yes, decidedly pretty in her peculiar style. Features rather too sharp, perhaps, and a sad want of colour. The Miss Stormonts rejoice in vivid complexions, but she has fine eyes." "Yes, fine eyes," assents Mrs. Groshen, "though I cannot say I like their expression." "No more do I," says Mrs. Groshen warmly. "Perhaps the nicest thing about her is her manner. She has really charming manners." "Yes, very agreeable manners," drawls Mrs. Groshen. "If they were not so painfully artificial." "That's the very thing that struck me," says Mrs. Groshen, brightening. The banker's wife rustles home in her silk attire, and tells Mr. Groshen at dinner how the Stormonts are trying to catch Mr. Trenchard's niece for their empty-headed son Frederick. "This Mr. Trenchard is very rich, I suppose?" she says interrogatively. "Enormously. I wish he'd keep an account with us," replies the banker. Sibyl accepts all the homage Redcastle can offer her with a tranquillity which raises her not a little in the estimation of the elite. She takes Mrs. Stormont's somewhat oppressive kindness as a matter of course, and is unawed by the splendour of the Groshens' dinner table, which for plate, china, glass, floral decoration, and hothouse fruit takes precedence of other tables in Redcastle. "I don't pretend to do things as Mrs. Groshen does," the Redcastle matrons inform one another apologetically. "We can't all be bankers." Mrs. Stormont volunteers her services in escorting Sibyl to concerts and other local entertainments, which a man of Mr. Trenchard's age may not care to patronize. Stephen Trenchard is quite willing that Sibyl should take advantage of these friendly offers, but to his surprise, and perhaps gratification, the girl refuses. "I am very fond of music, Uncle Trenchard," she says, "but I shall not go out of an evening without you. That would be a pretty way of keeping you company." "But, my dear, there is some difference between 70 and 20. Crabbed age and youth cannot dwell together. Or, if they do, youth must have a holiday now and then." "You are not crabbed, and I am very happy with you," answers Sibyl. "Flatterer!" exclaims Stephen Trenchard, not the less pleased. "Artful hussy," thinks Mrs. Stormont, and by, in the course of that cutting and wounding which passes for conversation in Redcastle, that lady informs Mrs. Groshen that Sibyl Faunthorpe is one of the deepest girls it was ever her fate to encounter. "She'll have that old man's money, my dear, every sixpence," says Mrs. Stormont emphatically. "Then your Fred ought to have her." "Why, you see, my dear, these Faunthorpes are people of no family." "You mean that he has asked her and been refused," remarks Mrs. Groshen astutely. "I don't think a Stormont is likely to find himself rejected by a parish doctor's niece," replies the colonel's wife, with suppressed indignation. "As to Mr. Trenchard's fortune, it is nothing to boast of, after all. It has all come from trade." This is a thrust at the banking business. "I fancy that is the source of most people's money nowadays," returns Mrs. Groshen blandly. "Professional men seldom seem to have much." Hereupon the two ladies, having indulged in a few friendly passes on their own account, return to the slaughter of the absent, and kiss each other affectionately at parting. Sibyl's dissipations are therefore, by her own desire, confined to those festivities in which Mr. Trenchard is bidden, and which take the dignified and substantive form of dinners. No one could think of inviting the master of Lancaster Lodge to come in the evening. Dinners of first quality, A1 at Lloyd's, are those to which Mr. Trenchard is bidden, and very splendid are the banquets with which at longish intervals he gratifies his friends in return. Wonderful is the regard which Redcastle has for Mr. Trenchard, and its eagerness to win and retain his friendship. It is not to be supposed that the elite have any expectation of profiting in a direct manner by his wealth. They have none. But they like to adorn their table with a rich man. They like to put him forward as one of their best friends, and to know that less privileged people are smitten with envy. They invite him very much for the same reason that they buy costly fruit out of season, and waxen blossoms from the hothouse instead of homely roses ripened in the sun. He reflects honor and glory upon themselves. It is a distinction to be on intimate terms with so much money. Mr. Trenchard's Redcastle friends brag about his wealth as if it were their own, smack their lips as they tell each other his income, and that he has never less than 50,000 at call, in case some sudden opportunity for a stroke of business should crop up in Calcutta. Has Stephen Trenchard told his new friends the amount of his income, or the sum he keeps uninvested? Hardly, for he is the most reticent of men as to his own affairs. But Redcastle has a knack of evolving facts about other people's business out of its inner consciousness. A year has slipped away, unawares almost, it seems to Sibyl, despite lurking pangs of remorse, silent hours given to regret. Life at Lancaster Lodge is such an easy thing. It is so pleasant to have everything one desires, to be praised and petted and invited here, there, and everywhere, and to refuse the most flattering invitations upon the last fashionable absurdity in notepaper. Pleasant, in a word, to be Miss Faunthorpe of Lancaster Lodge, instead of Miss Faunthorpe of nowhere. There is something of the lotus-eater's dreamy idlesse assuredly in this reposeful existence at Lancaster Lodge. Conscience has been lapped to sleep before the year is out, and Sibyl has persuaded herself that Alexis Secretan has carved his way to independence somehow or other, and is getting on very well indeed in some distant quarter of the globe, whence he will doubtless return by some happy conjuncture of events soon after Uncle Trenchard's death, which calamity in the course of nature will come to pass in a few years. And then we shall both be amply rewarded for the sacrifice we have made in this separation, muses Sibyl, as if the separation had been a voluntary one on her husband's side, as well as her own. Mr. Trenchard takes life tolerably easily, considering that he has his own way in everything, an indulgence which acts as an irritant upon some dispositions. He is feared and obeyed in his own house, flattered and caressed out of it. His servants work for him as no other man's servants work, and obey and tremble at his footstep. He accepts all that Redcastle can give him, dines out a good deal among the elite, tells his prosy old Indian stories again and again to listeners who always laugh in the right places. He enjoys the homage offered to his wealth, and chuckles over the weakness of his flatterers as he drives home with his niece. If my name were in the Gazette next Wednesday morning, before Wednesday night I should be friendless, he says, and the people we have dined with this evening would be gloating over my downfall. "Oh, uncle, they would be sorry, surely," exclaims Sibyl, more for the sake of conversation than from any belief in the good-heartedness of her friends. Sorry that they had been taken in, that they had mistaken a poor man for a rich one, no doubt. But for me, not a whit. Society in a place like Redcastle is made up on the cooperative system, is a club to which a man is admitted upon certain understood conditions. The first of these is that he should be well off. "Luckily, you are never likely to put our friends to the test," says Sibyl. "Of course not. And in the meanwhile, there's no harm in calling them friends. One name does as well as another when you are talking of unrealities." The year has gone, and Marion has not been asked to stay with her Uncle Trenchard, a fact which she resents bitterly and ascribes to double dealing on the part of Sibyl. She has been at Lancaster Lodge tolerably often, but only as Sibyl's visitor. And although she accepts all Sibyl's invitations, it is almost unbearable to be invited and patronized by a sister. Sibyl has established herself as Mr. Trenchard's adopted daughter. He coolly declares that she suits him better than Marian, and that she is to keep his house till she marries. I suppose I must have made myself very disagreeable to him in the 3 months I spent here, remarks Marian one bright April afternoon, digging her croquet ball into the ground with misused energy. She has come to spend the afternoon with Sibyl. "Oh, no, dear, I don't think it was so bad as that," replies Sibyl graciously. "But you didn't succeed in making yourself agreeable to him." "I know I made myself a perfect slave," complains the injured Marian, "toasting his newspapers, and running for his slippers, and peeling walnuts for him until my fingers were black. I'm sure I don't know what he wants, the nasty old thing." "No, really, Marian, I can't consent to hear the best of uncles called names. On his own croquet lawn, too." "Very much the best of uncles for you. But give me Uncle Robert." "Well, my dear, you've got him. Haven't I left you in undisturbed possession of our paternal uncle?" "All I can say is that it is positive injustice," murmurs Marian as the game proceeds. Frederick Stormont strolls in 5 minutes afterwards and takes a mallet, whereupon the sisters become all smiles and graciousness. He goes in to afternoon tea with them, and they sit on the crimson brocade sofas, sipping orange pekoe out of Indian teacups, waited on by the most accomplished of footmen, and discussing the petty gossip of above and below bar. An empty life, assuredly, but it is pleasant to sit in a handsome room, almost an indoor garden in its abundance of choicest flowers, a sunlit lawn beyond the open window. Pleasant to be dressed in the latest fashion, pleasant to be admired, even though the eyes of the admirer are pale in hue and porcine in shape. Pleasant to feel that in life's eager race one has shot ever so far ahead of one's younger sister. So at least feels Sibyl, as she accepts Mr. Stormont's vapid homage, and allows Marian to be useful as her foil. Mrs. Groshen is strictly incorrect in her conjecture about this young man's wooing. Frederick has not been rejected by Mr. Trenchard's niece. He has not yet ventured to propose to her, and when pushed hard upon the subject by his father, he always asks for time. "I think she likes me," he says complacently, "but by Jove, you know it doesn't do for a man to hurry that kind of thing. You're so impatient, you see. You want a fellow to round the Cape before he's got across the Bay of Biscay. Miss Faunthorpe has a great deal of reserve about her, and that kind of thing, and she's just the sort of girl to throw over a fellow who proposed to her before she's quite made up her mind about liking him." "She's a long time making up her mind about you," replies the Colonel pensively. "And upon my word, you know, Fred, if you don't marry a woman with money, you'll have to do something for yourself. Things can't go on like this much longer. By Jove, you know, you'll have to emigrate. I don't see that there's anything you could do in England. You're too old for the army or the navy or the civil service. You'll have to try the colonies. I might do something. Kangaroo shooting in New Zealand," said Frederick meditatively. "Hang it, sir! A man can't get his living kangaroo shooting," roars the Colonel. "You'd better marry Trenchard's niece." "She's a very jolly girl," says Fred vaguely. He would have called Electra, or Antigone, Joan of Arc, or Mary Stuart jolly. He knows no higher praise to bestow on the woman of his choice. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 14. Making Ready for Victory. The fair spring days flit by. The violets and primroses, bluebells and windflowers fade in the copses, unseen, unknown, uncared for, save by a few peasant children. The white blossoms of the pears, the pinky bloom of the apples, have drifted away on the light west winds like summer snow. Ferns uncurl their tender fronds in thicket and lane, and stand up to hail the summer. The cuckoo's last call dies in the silence of the wood. The skylark's clear carol rings out above the tall green corn. Summer has come, and the little children of Redcastle, the children of the commonalty at least, wander far afield under the midday sun and lose themselves in distant woods and drain the cup of summer joys to the dregs. The children of the elite regard summer as a period in which they wear starched frock, find French and German grammar more than usually oppressive, and entertain hopes of going to the seaside. Sybil welcomes June and the roses with a languid greeting. That smooth, easy life has become to pall a little on Stephen Trenchard's niece. Despite its pleasantness, it is at best a monotonous existence, and youth's eager spirit revolts against monotony. Not willingly would Sybil confess even to herself that she is tired of Lancaster Lodge, and Redcastle dinner parties, Redcastle compliments, Redcastle life altogether. She wishes that her uncle would extend the circle of his acquaintance, yet is obliged to admit that it would not be easy for him to do so at Redcastle. The county people have not called upon Mr. Trenchard. Aloof in their fastnesses among the hills and moors, the county people refuse to bow to the golden calf, hug themselves in their social privileges, and do not recognize the fact of an old gentleman having made money in India as a reason why they should go out of the beaten track to take notice of him. From their lofty region of territorial estate, they look down with an equal disdain upon professional and commercial people who live in a town and call 5 acres of garden and paddock land. Stephen Trenchard's million is nothing to them, or, if they think of his wealth at all, it is with resentment as a sign of the times and an irrefutable proof that England is going to the dogs. Perhaps it is the very fact of the county people's exclusiveness which makes Sybil regard them with a certain amount of interest. Those big, broad-shouldered young men she has seen ride past her window in the hunting season, sitting their horses much more easily than Frederick Stormont sits his chair, glorious in pink and buckskins, loud-voiced, large-whiskered, seems to her of a different race from young Groshen or young Stormont or Dr. Mitson's pale-faced, speckled son, whose manly vigor has degenerated into brains, Mr. Twells the curate, or Mr. Jewson the lawyer. To her fancy there is something grand about these sons of the soil, a rough nobility, an outspoken contempt for the petty conventionalities which constitute the small despotism of Redcastle society. Caesar est supra grammaticam. The county people are above good manners. That is to say, good manners as understood in Redcastle. The town and the county meet occasionally in the hunting field, where the county looks on with a smile at some of the town's feats in horsemanship, leaves the town 3 fields behind for the most part, and now and then deposits the town in ditches or hangs it out to dry on a stiff bullfinch. Twice in every year, town and county meet on equal ground. Redcastle, small and obscure as it is in the eyes of the outer world, boasts a race course, and as pretty a course in a small way as any in England. Less than a mile out of the town, on that broad open common known as Redcastle Woods, gleam the white posts of the course and the white walls of the stand, a permanent and substantial building. Redcastle has its spring and summer meeting 2 days on each occasion, and just the merriest 2 days in that part of the world. Granted that horses of much weight or prestige rarely appear at Redcastle. The fact only leaves the ground open to the horses of the local aristocracy, and makes the races so much the more interesting to Redcastle itself. Sibyl has never seen a race in her life, and it is not without a struggle that she declined Mrs. Stormont's invitation to join her party at the spring meeting. Now comes the summer meeting, and another invitation from the leader of Redcastle society. Rose and Violet, the dear girls, are named after those favourite flowers. 5 feet 10 each of them, and with the complexions of cookmaids. Rose and Violet will be so disappointed if you refuse to join our party, my dear Sibyl. Of course, I say nothing of Fred's feelings. "Why don't you go with them, child?" said Mr. Trenchard, when Sibyl reads him the letter, laughing as she reads. "I don't care for pleasures that you cannot share, uncle." "Nonsense, my dear. I could share this if I liked. For my part, I could never understand what people could see in a race, unless as a hazardous investment with the possibility of enormous returns. I can fancy a bookman enjoying the races in a business-like way, but for people to sit in their carriages to look on at other people winning or losing and call it pleasure, that passes my comprehension." "I should like to see a race for once in my life," says Sibyl, languishing for any novel sensation that may ruffle the mill pond of her existence. "Then write and accept Mrs. Stormont's invitation, my dear." "You won't think me unkind for going without you?" "I should think you much more unkind if you wanted me to go with you." So it is settled. Sibyl tells her dear Mrs. Stormont that she is charmed to accept her kind invitation, and summons Miss Eylett to immediate council. She has ever so many pretty dresses in her wardrobe, but she must have something new for this occasion, with a view to crushing dear Violet and Rose by the exhibition of a dress they have never seen before. The invitation has been given a week before the races, so there is time for preparation. The council is a solemn one, and by the intensity of Sibyl's desire to look her best may be measured her hatred of dear Rose and Violet. "Never mind, Miss Eylett," she begins, after she has looked through La Foilet and pronounced all the illustrations hideous. "I must have nothing that can possibly look like a shopkeeper's wife's Sunday gown. No flaming pink or blue that people can see a mile off." "Mauve, or a rich voilette now," suggests Miss Eylett in her persuasive voice. "My dear Eylett, mauve and violet are the colours vulgar people choose when they want to be genteel. A sweet French grey. Give me a housemaid's afternoon gown at once. A cinnamon brown. A doctor's wife's dinner dress. No, I must have some pale, indistinct colour, softened with a cloud of India muslin. A dress which looks nothing in particular at a distance, but which is fit for a princess when you come to look into it. Mr. Trenchard gave me an embroidered Indian muslin, which will be just the thing over a pale maize-corded silk. You know the shade I mean. Straw colour, shot with apricot." Sibyl opens a huge camphor chest in which she keeps her treasures, and displays a muslin dress fine as a cobweb, and covered with embroidery. "Exquisite!" exclaims Miss Eylett. "What taste you have, Miss Faunthorpe!" She would have been just as enthusiastic had Sibyl suggested pickled cabbage colour picked out with pea green. "And you must make me a bonnet exactly to match the dress." "Of course, Miss Faunthorpe." "I'll go round to Carmichael's at once and see if they've got the colour, and if they haven't, I'll take the 3 o'clock train to Crampston." The question settled, Sibyl feels easy in her mind, and looks forward to next week with pleasure. The summer is at its height, mid-July, and a delicious July, warm, dry, ripening roses and ripening corn, swelling the peaches on the wall and reddening the apples in the orchard, all the land basking in the sun, and Redcastle High Street a place to look at blinkingly between 2 and 5 in the afternoon, and a burning ploughshare to walk upon. Marion and Jenny come toiling along the sun-banked pavement in the very hottest hour of the afternoon to visit their prosperous sister. Jane, splendid in the peach-coloured silk and new boots, and a hat that is too small for her large round head, with its thick brown hair in curls that no application of the hairbrush will reduce from their disorder to the smoothness of civilization. Sibyl receives her sisters languidly under the plane trees, exhausted by her interview with Miss Eylett. Marion's temper is not improved by the warm walk, or by the labour of getting Jenny up in a style befitting Lancaster Lodge. "There was never such a troublesome child," she complains as she sinks into a rustic armchair, conscious that her face is the colour of a boiled lobster, while Sibyl in a cream-coloured Indian silk and a turquoise blue sash is looking divinely pale. "Look at her legs. She has grown out of that frock already, and as for ever keeping her decently dressed, I defy you. There's the print of a slice of bread and butter on the front breadth, and smears of marmalade all over the sleeves, though she's only worn the frock on Sundays." "Let her wear it every day and wear it out," says Sibyl generously. "She shall have another for best." "Oh, you dear," cries Jenny. "But if you knew what a life Marion leads me when I've a good frock on, you might think it a greater charity never to give me one." "You ungrateful minx," exclaims Marion. "Didn't I stand half an hour this boiling afternoon doing your hair?" "Pulling it, you mean," responds Jenny. "If you'd combed it with a hay-fork and brushed it with a bush-harrow, you couldn't have hurt me more." "There's gratitude," ejaculates Marion, pointing to the offender. "My idea of gratitude is thankfulness for things we want," reasons Jenny, who is good at argument. "I didn't want my hair pulled." "Well, Sibyl," says Marion, "is Uncle Trenchard going to the races?" Everybody thinks and talks of the races at this time. It is the one subject of conversation in Redcastle, a rare thing for Redcastle to have so much as one subject of conversation. As a rule, the town contrives to be conversational about nothing. "No, Uncle Trenchard hates races. I am going with the Stormonts." "Indeed? I thought you wouldn't go anywhere without your uncle." "No more I would in an ordinary way, but I felt a kind of interest in the races. One hears so much of them." "I feel a kind of interest in them too," says Marion, with an injured air. "I have been hearing about Redcastle races ever since I left school, and yet living so near I have never seen them. Uncle Robert has got a pony that would take us, but he has not got the spirit. You might have asked Uncle Trenchard to let you take us all in his barouche. I dare say Uncle Robert would have gone if you'd taken him." Sibyl looks doubtful as to the delight of such a family party. "I've accepted Mrs. Stormont's invitation, you see," she replies apologetically. "Oh, yes, of course. Catch you putting yourself out of the way for anybody. Another girl in your position might have thought of her poor relations. What are you going to wear?" Sybil describes the costume in which she and Miss Eylett have arranged that morning. Poor Marian listens in an agony of envy. "What a lot of money Uncle Trenchard must give you!" she exclaims. "No, he doesn't give me much, but he allows me to keep an account at Carmichael's." "Well," sighs Marian, "I would give a year of my life to go to the races this day week." "What a pity our lives are not transferable, like railway stock," says Sybil airily. She is not deeply moved by Marian's piteous condition. Her mind is occupied with a prophetic vision of her triumphs next Wednesday. She will see and be seen by the county. That idea is more inspiring than the prospect of a day spent with the Stormonts, whom she knows by heart, or even the privilege of beholding Mrs. Groshen's raiment, which is sure to be resplendent and of the very latest fashion, however hideous in the abstract and individually unbecoming that fashion may be. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 15. Town and County. A curious thing happens that evening after dinner. It is Mr. Trenchard's habit to read the daily papers at his ease in the drawing-room as soon as he is withdrawn from the dinner-table. Or, if he is idly disposed, Sybil reads to him and beguiles him into placid slumber. This evening he reads the papers for himself, beginning as usual with the Times, which he studies profoundly. He sits in his easy chair by one open window. Sybil yawns over a novel at another. Rather dreary these summer evenings at Lancaster Lodge, when twilight's purple shadows rise ghost-like among the trees on the lawn, and the gates are closed upon the outer world. Welcome even such commonplace interruption as the advent of Frederick Stormont, and an adjournment to the billiard-room. Sybil looks up from her book with a start at a sudden movement of her uncle's. What was that half-stifled exclamation which sounded so like an oath? Stephen Trenchard is standing up, with the paper crumpled in his right hand, staring blankly at his niece. She goes to him, looks at him in frightened interrogation, but he neither sees nor hears her. Is this some kind of seizure? Epileptic? Paralytic? She thinks so tremblingly for a moment, before Mr. Trenchard's keen black eyes assume their power of vision and look into hers. "Dearest uncle, what is the matter?" "Nothing that need concern you, Sybil. A friend, an old friend of mine, dead in India. The announcement of his death shocked me, that's all. I ought not to have been surprised. At my age, a man must expect old friends to drop off. Go back to your book, my dear. There's no reason for you to be agitated." Sybil looks wonderingly at the paper in her uncle's hand. It is not the supplement. That, with its births, marriages, and deaths, lies on the carpet unopened. She remembers that the deaths of distinguished people are sometimes recorded in the body of the paper, and this friend of her uncle's is doubtless a person worthy of an obituary paragraph. "I am so sorry," she says sympathetically. "So am I. But it was to be expected. Go back to your book, child." Perceiving that sympathy is not required, Sybil returns to her seat by the distant window. Marian would have hung about her uncle for a quarter of an hour, bemoaning his loss and offering stale crumbs of consolation. Sybil hears the door shut 10 minutes afterwards, and looking up, sees that Stephen Trenchard has vanished. She hastens to look for the newspapers, eager to find out all she can about her uncle's departed friend. But Mr. Trenchard has taken the papers with him, and when she searches for them next day in his study and in other likely places, they are not to be found. Nor does Mr. Trenchard reappear that evening. The butler brings Sibyl a message at tea-time to the effect that his master has letters to write, and will take tea in his study. So that particular infusion of hyson with which Mr. Trenchard is in the habit of irritating his nerves is carried to the study on a salver, and Sibyl is left to spend her evening alone. There are times on just such an evening as this when memory recalls that one room in Dixon Street, Chelsea, and his company whose easy temper and natural gaiety of heart could brighten deepest poverty with an occasional ray of light. If I could have borne poverty as well as he, we might have struggled on together to the end, she thinks with a touch of remorse. But then, what a pity it would have been to lose Uncle Trenchard's fortune. How ghastly pale he looked tonight, poor dear man. Mr. Trenchard seems a little out of sort for the next few days, not quite so keen and far-seeing, so exacting or high-handed in his household as it is his wont to be. He has a preoccupied air, a thoughtful look, and is evidently much concerned by the loss of that departed friend, whose name he has not mentioned. Sibyl wonders at this a little, never having heard Mr. Trenchard talk of any intimate friend in India. He has told numerous stories of Calcutta society, of trade and chicanery in that palatial city, but of friendship, of intimate congenial companions, he has not breathed a word. Nor, in the year and a half of his residence at Redcastle, has a single Anglo-Indian acquaintance visited him. Impossible to imagine a man more independent of friendship, yet he seems cut to the quick by the death of this distant friend, and is slow to recover his equanimity. Mrs. Stormont calls about 3 days before the races, and finds Mr. Trenchard and his niece on the lawn, the gentleman asleep or meditating, his countenance shrouded by an orange-coloured bandana, like a new veiled prophet, the lady working point lace at a stitch a minute. The kind soul has come to talk about the races. "I wish you could be induced to join us, dear Mr. Trenchard." "You're very good, my dear madam, but the thing is not in my way. I hardly know whether a horse should have 4 legs or 6. If you were to show me a 6-legged animal, I doubt if I should remark the redundancy." "And yet you have the finest carriage horses in Redcastle." "Because I did not choose them myself, madam." "I shall call for you at 12:30, my dear," says Mrs. Stormont, turning to Sibyl. "Fred is going to ride. I shall hire Shrub's landau and pair. My poor dear ponies would be frightened to death on a race-course." Shrub is the proprietor of the George Hotel and Livery Stables, and has the honour of ministering to the elite on all state occasions. "Why hire Shrub's landau when my barouche is at your service?" asked Mr. Trenchard. "I shall be glad to give that idle coachman of mine a day's work." "My dear Mr. Trenchard, you are too kind. Such an idea never entered my head." "Odd if it didn't," thinks Sibyl, "when you are always making use of the carriage in some way or other." The Stormonts have allowed Sibyl to drive them a good deal during the last few months, to the infinite relief of the ponies and the buck-basket, both of which institutions are slightly the worse for wear. You may get 15 years' good work out of a pony, but when he approaches his majority, his powers are apt to wane. Mrs. Stormont allows herself to be entreated, and finally yields gracefully, and with an airy coquetry, but only on condition that Mr. Trenchard shall dine with them on the race day. This he promises, with certain reservations. "If I feel myself up to the mark, I'll come," he says. "But I have not been particularly well lately." "Uncle Trenchard has lost an old friend in India," explains Sibyl, and seeing her uncle's impatient frown, is sorry she has made the remark. "Indeed!" exclaims Mrs. Stormont, thirsting for information. "In the civil service or the army? The Colonel has many old Indian friends." "My friend was neither in the civil service nor the army," says Mr. Trenchard, and says no more. Mrs. Stormont is disappointed, but she has got the carriage, which was the object of her visit, so she drifts off into the usual Redcastle talk. Have you seen the Groshens lately? And did you hear that Dr. Mitsand has been very ill? And so on, with which interesting discourse she beguiles the next half hour. The race day comes with the calendar, and a glorious day, hot blue sky, roads white with dust, grass brown and slippery, bad for the horses, opine the learned in such matters. The grand stand is gleaming in the sun, flags are flying, the town is all astir, flies are driving to and fro between station and racecourse, with visitors from Crampston, people who smell of commerce and dockyard, oakum and tar, a rough lot in the estimation of genteel Redcastle. At 12:30 the Trenchard barouche calls for Mrs. Stormont and her 2 daughters. Sibyl has taken her place in it already. She wishes to sit with her back to the horses, but this Mrs. Stormont will not allow, and after a little polite skirmishing she takes her place next to that lady, the Miss Stormonts side by side on the opposite seat, which they fill to overflowing. On the way to the course, the ladies have time for a silent review of each other's apparel. Rose and Violet are in washed muslins and homemade bonnets. Mrs. Stormont wears her dove-coloured moire, which is an institution in Redcastle, and as well known as the town clock. "Here comes Mrs. Groshen's carriage. I suppose she is going to crush us with some new finery," says Rose, with a venomous look at the maize silk and India muslin. "I hope it will be in a little better taste than usual," remarks Violet, who is of a more calculating temper than her sister. "What lovely embroidery that is of yours, Sibyl. I can't help noticing it." Frederick joins the party presently on a brute of a grey horse, whose ownership he participates with young Jewson, the lawyer's son. The joint animal, having very little mouth to speak of at the best, and being ridden on opposite principles by his 2 proprietors, is about as manageable as a watering-place donkey. Frank Jewson, who is the better equestrian of the co-owners, boasts that he rides with his knees. Fred Stormont hangs on by the reins, and makes the wretched quadruped's mouth his fulcrum. He is not happy on horseback himself, or the cause of happiness to his steed, and the joint proprietorship is an extravagance which he can ill afford. But he feels that the horse gives him social status, and endures bravely. The beast is consistent, and starting with a fixed idea that the sooner he gets back to his stables the better for his own well-being, tugs desperately at every turning in the endeavour to make a short cut home, and if confronted in his straight course with any object which he dislikes, wheels sharp around and sets off at a lively trot stablewards. The first half hour of Mr. Stormont's ride is one prolonged tussle with the grey, which, in the pride of their hearts, the joint proprietors have christened Flying Dutchman. "The Dutchman is awfully fresh to-day, Fred," remonstrates Rose, when the grey has backed into the landau half a dozen times in his efforts to go up every side street or alley. "Hadn't you better try him on the curb?" "I think I am riding him on the curb," says Fred, looking doubtfully at his reins, which are in an inextricable muddle. "The fact is, Jewson spoils his mouth. Yah, you beast, what's the matter now?" as the Dutchman, taking objection to a very small child in a white pinafore, gathers all his legs together, collapses, and scrambles frantically across the street with a noise as of a detachment of cavalry. "Is that a fit?" asks Sibyl, when Mr. Trenchard's horses have recovered from their consternation at this manoeuvre. "No, it's only a shy. He cannot stand a perambulator." "Nor a woman in a red cloak, nor a baker's cart, nor a washing basket, nor a chimney sweep, nor a heap of stones, nor an organ," says Rose indignantly. "I never knew such a beast. He'll have your life some day, Fred, I feel convinced." "He's more than half a thoroughbred," says Frederick, leaning over to pat the animal's neck, an attention which the Dutchman resents by a sudden slouch forward and a furious shake of his head, whereby he all but precipitates Fred upon the paving stones. "Are you fond of riding?" asks Sibyl, as the horseman pulls himself together, scarlet after his struggles with his steed, and settles into a jolting trot beside the barouche. "Passionately," says Fred, the syllables jerked out of him piecemeal by the grey. "But that seems rather an uncomfortable horse to ride." "He's a little fidgety in the town, but he's splendid when you get him on the turf. You should see him in a stretching gallop across the grass." Mr. Stormont omits to state that in these stretching gallops he is entirely at the Dutchman's mercy, and suffers abject terror. They turn out of the market-place presently into a broad lane leading to the woods, a lane in which there are nice old houses on one side and orchards on the other, and at the top of this lane they come out of that open stretch of greensward, with a hollow full of hazel bushes, hawthorn, and blackberry here and there, which is dignified with the name of Redcastle Woods. Yonder towers the stand, white in the sunshine, flags, blue, red, and yellow, fluttering gaily, the oval course on the southern side of a slope, and a fringe of carriages and smartly dressed people. A simple rustic racecourse, with its local gentry and sprinkling of citizens from busy Cramston. The Stormont barouche takes its position among the great ones of the land, and by good luck finds itself in the very lap of the county. The magnates of Redcastle are 6 carriages off, Mrs. Groshen becking and nodding at her friends, gorgeously arrayed in a brilliant mauve silk which glistens in the sun, and a bonnet with feathers. There are many greetings between Mrs. Stormont and her neighbours, for the Stormonts occupy the border line of Redcastle society, and are graciously regarded by the county families. Loud how-do-you-do's are uttered by the occupants of a tall coach next door to the barouche. 2 young men and 2 young women are seated on the box, the men in homespun tweed, the women in brown holland and brown straw hats. 2 grooms in dark green and mahogany tops are in attendance. "Are we going to have some good racing, Sir Wilfrid?" asked Mrs. Stormont, radiant at finding herself in such good company, and Mrs. Groshen afar off, like Dives. The bigger of the grey men answers in a loud, good-natured voice, dropping lightly down from his perch and coming close to the barouche. "Not much fun, I'm afraid. Wretched lot of leather-platers. Going to speculate, Miss Stormont? Better put something on Stagheen for the cup. Sure to win." He addresses himself to the fair Rose, shaking hands with her the while, but he looks at Sibyl. That delicate, clear-cut face, with its brown eyes, is strange to him, and in a place where everybody knows everybody else, that is enough to awaken interest. Sibyl remembers him as one of the hunters she has seen ride past the walls of Lancaster Lodge, clad in weather-stained scarlet. He is tall, 6'2", broad-shouldered, with the frame of an athlete. He has shaggy brown hair, shaggy brown moustache, good-humoured grey eyes, a commonplace nose, a good firm mouth, and strong square chin, large hands in well-worn tan gloves. "Sir Wilfrid Cardinal, Miss Faunthorpe," says Mrs. Stormont graciously. Sir Wilfrid takes off his hat and looks pleased, but is little wiser than before. This name of Faunthorpe means nothing for him. "Fond of racing?" he inquires, following up the introduction. "This is the first time I was ever at a race," replies Sibyl, "but I think I shall enjoy it very much." "Then you don't belong to this part of the country, I suppose? We Yorkshire folks are always going to races." "Yes, I have lived in Redcastle ever since, or almost ever since I left school." "And have never come to the races?" "I couldn't get anybody to bring me," replies Sibyl frankly. "Neither of my uncles cares about races." "Good gracious!" This exclamation is evoked by a most startling apparition on the other side of the course, exactly opposite the barouche. A shabby old pony carriage, quite the most ancient vehicle of its kind in Redcastle. A dilapidated, unkempt pony, with his nose in a nose-bag. An elderly gentleman in a discoloured white hat, a young woman in pink muslin, and a girl of nondescript appearance in short petticoats, standing on the back seat of the pony carriage in order the better to survey the brilliant scene, and making a positively awful exhibition of her legs. These are Uncle Robert, Marion, and Jenny. Sibyl beholds them with unmitigated consternation. She will be obliged to acknowledge them presently, to avow her relationship to that wretched chaise, that odious pony, in the face of the county families, nay, the highest and mightiest of the high and mighty, the Cardinals of the How, people she has heard the Stormonts talk about with as much reverence as if they had the prosperity of the county in their keeping, wound up the sun like a clock, and turned on the rain from a tap in their custody. "This is Marion's doings," thinks Sibyl indignantly. "That girl is capable of anything. To think that they must needs come and perch themselves exactly opposite us." There seems deliberate malice in the act. A few minutes ago there was only empty space where the pony chaise stands now. The chaise has been placed there since the arrival of the barouche. Dr. Faunthorpe surveys his niece's party mildly through his spectacles. Marion nods and kisses her hand. But Sibyl, once having seen her danger, looks every way except towards the doctor's chaise. Jenny, more energetic than her elders, is not to be baffled. Finding nods and hand-kissing unnoticed, she raises her shrill young voice and screams, "Sibyl! Sibyl! Look this way, Sibyl!" "Who is that leggy child calling?" asks Sir Wilfrid, looking at Jenny through his race-glass, which brings her to the end of his nose. "What an excitable young person! And what a funny party! A little old man in spectacles and a white hat, a tall young woman with ginger hair, and that leggy child dancing about upon the cushions. And what a pony! The very one Noah had in the ark, I should think." Sibyl grows crimson. Can she acknowledge her kith and kin after this? While she hesitates, Mrs. Stormont raises her gold-rimmed binoculars and scrutinizes the opposite party. "Why, my dear," she exclaims, not sorry to set off any obligation involved in the loan of the barouche by the humiliation of its owner, "it's that dear good little man, Dr. Faunthorpe, and your sisters. I wonder you didn't recognize the pony. There's not another like him in Redcastle." "Is that little girl your sister?" asks Sir Wilfrid. "I beg your pardon, and hers, if I said anything impertinent. She seems a fine, high-spirited girl, but in an awful state of excitement. Shall I bring her across to you? She wants to speak to you, I fancy." "Oh, pray leave her where she is," replies Sibyl. "She's a dreadful nuisance. There, there, child. nodding to the obnoxious hoyden. "Won't that do?" Jane kisses her hand again vehemently, and having succeeded in attracting her sister's attention, seems tolerably resigned. Sibyl feels that her maize-coloured silk and India muslin, the barouche, and all things, are a failure after this. And there are the Miss Cardinals in their plain holland gowns with satchels at their waists, brown hats, brown feathers, brown holland umbrellas, singularly plain attire, which looks in better form for a race-course than Sibyl's flower show costume. Sir Wilfrid stands by the barouche for an hour or more, and tells Sibyl all about the horses. He devotes himself to her almost exclusively before the face of Redcastle. Fred Stormont, pounding restlessly about upon the grey, and bringing that excited animal to anchor beside the barouche when he can, feels that he is nowhere, and begins to think that he has erred on the side of caution and hesitancy in his wooing of Stephen Trenchard's niece. The races may not be good races from a professional point of view. The horses may be the very refuse of famous stables, but the excitement and exhilaration of the crowd are not lessened by that fact. No weighty stakes are lost or won, but everyone seems happy. Broad grins are the only wear. There is a great deal of picnicking between the races, and people who would have lived through the day at home on a biscuit and a glass of sherry do wild things in the consumption of lobster salad, chicken, mayonnaise, and pigeon pie. Mrs. Stormont has provided the most refined of baskets, delicate papers of anchovy and chicken sandwiches, fragile biscuits, some choice fruit, and a bottle of dry sherry. These favours she dispenses to her party, while Sir Wilfrid and his people are devouring their lobster salad on the roof of the drag, enlivened by the running fire of champagne corks. Fred, roving to and fro on the grey, declines the maternal sherry. "No, thanks, mother. When I'm dry myself, I don't want my wine dry. I'll go and do a bitter at the stand presently." Sibyl has gradually recovered that death blow of the pony carriage. Sir Wilfrid Cardinal's attentions have put her in a good humour. It is as if some prince of the blood royal had paid her homage in the presence of his subjects, and she knows that Mrs. Groshen and Mrs. Marlin Spike, the Miss Jewsons, and above all, dearest Rose and Violet, will be provoked to envy by the distinction thus conferred upon her. Indeed, dear Rose's brow has a cloudy look already, and Violet is snappish. Only Mrs. Stormont preserves her equanimity, and smiles upon the baronet when he redescends from the drag and takes up his position beside the barouche. Sibyl's ignorance of racing matters is curiously attractive to him from its novelty, his sisters being learned in the minutest details of the turf, and as well up in stable talk as their brother's stud-groom, under whom they have graduated. He lingers by her side till the races are nearly over, and his grooms go to fetch the horses. The important duty of seeing these animals put to distracts him a little, but he comes back again at the last to say good-bye to Mrs. Stormont and her daughters, and to Sibyl. "I should like you to know my sisters," he says. "I am sure you'd suit each other." A mendacious assertion, inspired by the exigencies of the situation, Sir Wilfrid knowing very well that town and county have seldom an idea in common. He has not ventured to bring about an introduction on the course, his sisters being at an inconvenient altitude, and of an uncertain temper. But he feels that he must contrive to see more of Miss Faunthorpe somehow or other. Who can she be? She is too richly dressed for a governess, and the Stormonts are too civil to her. Yet she must be a nobody, or Mrs. Stormont would have taken care to parade her people. He resolves to call on the Stormonts in a day or two, and find out all about their protégée, and, sustained by this resolution, he takes his reluctant leave. How splendid his coach looks to Sibyl! The 4 broad-chested bays, with their honest English-looking heads, horses that mean work, the steel chains, the black harness, austerely simple in its mounting, the grooms in Lincoln green, the two girls in brown holland nodding good-bye to the Stormonts as Sir Wilfrid drives away, making a wide sweep upon the turf, his horses going as if this was the happiest moment of their lives, his grooms climbing into their places after the team has started, with some hazard of life and limb, but with honour to themselves. "Charming man, Sir Wilfrid Cardinal," says Mrs. Stormont. "The Cardinals are one of the oldest of our county families. How do you like him, Sybil?" "He seems very good-natured," replies Sybil carelessly. What are the Cardinals to her? And what avails this young man's admiration, save to flaunt in the face of her acquaintance? Her name is written in the book of fate, and in the registers of St. Apollonius, Pimlico. The soul of good nature! His sisters are charming, too. Great friends of Rose and Violet's. Uncommon intimate, says Fred, who has dragged that unyielding grey up to the carriage once more. They see one another twice a year, I should think. For my part, I detest the county people. They are a parcel of narrow-minded snobs who think the beginning and end of life is to ride straight to hounds. Having relieved his jealous pangs by this vindictive burst, Fred goes to look after Mr. Trenchard's horses, and presently the barouche falls in with the line of vehicles driving towards the town, Fred and the grey in attendance, that animal suddenly amenable to reason now that he is going back to his stable. Sybil drives home with the Stormonts, with whom she is to dine. "I do hope your dear uncle will join us at dinner," says Mrs. Stormont. That hope is nipped in the bud, for among the day's letters Mrs. Stormont finds a note from Stephen Trenchard. "Dear Mrs. Stormont, I do not feel well enough to avail myself of your kind invitation for this evening, so must ask you to excuse me. I will send the carriage for Sybil at 10:30. Yours very truly, Stephen Trenchard." "I'm afraid your uncle is breaking up, my dear," remarks Mrs. Stormont with a sigh. "I saw a change in him when I called the other day." "That is strange," says Sybil, "for he has not been actually ill. He has not kept his room for a single day." "He is a man of iron nerves, my love, and would be reluctant to give way to illness. But I feel sure that he is declining. At his age, and after a life in India, you cannot expect to have him with you many years." Sybil looks grave. No, she has not counted on her uncle living many years, or at least when she deserted her husband she told herself that the old man's life could be but brief, and that a few years of patience would be rewarded by fortune and independence for all her life to come. But since she has lived with Uncle Trenchard, she has been inclined to think differently. In his wiry frame and active habits, his temperance, his iron nerves, there seems the promise of life prolonged to its utmost limits. He may live to be 90, and she to be almost an old woman ere she reap the wages of her toil. And in that case, what is to become of Alexis? Mrs. Stormont's remark inspires a new hope. The end may not be so far off after all. She is not ungrateful to her uncle. She is not without some kind of affection for him. But the hope of reunion with her husband, of forgiveness and atonement, is sweet. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 16. A Mysterious Visitor. The dinner at the Stormonts is as other dinners in the same house. The guests are Mr. and Mrs. Groshen, Dr. and Mrs. Mitsand, and one Miss Mitsand, the ugliest, as Fred remarks with a sense of injury. The flower pots on the table, the silver dishes, the ruby hock glasses, the finger glasses engraved with the Greek key pattern, the talk, the twaddle, Mrs. Groshen's Honiton lace, how well Sibyl know them all. She breathes a sigh for the days that are gone, before that slow, pompous banquet is ended, and think that after all there was more pleasure in a haddock and a cup of tea in Dixon Street than in all this provincial splendour. The talk is chiefly of the races, who was there and who was not there. The county families are brought on the table and discussed fully, together with the genealogies, which are as well known and as complicated as if they were Greek heroes or demigods. Mrs. Stormont praises Sir Wilfrid Cardinal and those dear girls his sisters, and talks of the rose garden and ferneries at the How, whereby she bears down rather heavily upon Mrs. Groshen, who has never been bidden to that earthly paradise. Mr. Groshen opines that Sir Wilfrid is better off than most of the county people, whom he disparages as a shabby lot, but adds that at the rate Sir Wilfrid is going on with his drags and hunters, he is likely to outrun the constable before he is many years older. That the evening entertainment which follows the feast is dull, not even Mrs. Stormont's dearest friend, Mrs. Groshen, could deny, were her views taken on the subject. Sibyl knows every piece of furniture in the drawing-room by heart, every photograph in the album. She knows the Miss Stormonts' favourite fantasias better than those performers themselves, or they would play more correctly. She knows exactly how she will be asked to play one of her lovely pieces, or to sing one of her sweet songs, and how the young ladies will pretend to delight in Chopin, and the elders praise her wonderful fingering, and how stifled yawns will at intervals prevail among the company. She knows how Violet will tell her about some new fern she has discovered, such a darling, and how Rose will ask her if she is going on the Continent this year, and will then favour her with some interesting facts about her Swiss tour with her papa 3 years ago. What a blessed relief when the clock on the mantelpiece strikes 11. Sibyl has been wondering for ever so long why her carriage has not been announced. "Dear Mrs. Stormont, I think they must have forgotten me," she says. "But we are such near neighbours, I can walk home easily." "My love, it is quite early. Don't talk of going. The carriage will come for you, I am sure. We want another of those delicious sonatas." "Not going surely, Mrs. Groshen?" cries Mrs. Stormont, rejoicing in her soul to see the banker and his wife advancing to her, stately and smiling, to tell her that they have spent a most enjoyable evening. Every one discovers that it is frightfully late. No one would have supposed it for an instant. How swift are the pinions of time when pleasure quickens them. Mrs. Stormont, pressed by Sibyl, makes an inquiry about Mr. Trenchard's carriage. It has not come. "We walked here," said Mr. Groshen. "Matilda grumbled about her dress, but I wouldn't have my horses harnessed again after they had come from the race course, and I couldn't have them standing in harness while she changed her dress. It is no use having fine horses if you don't study them a little. And we're such near neighbours. We'll take care of you, Miss Faunthorpe, if you don't mind walking." "I should like it," says Sibyl, with a longing look at the cool purple night beyond the open window of the gas-lit room. Fred springs up eagerly from the ottoman on which he has been sitting in patient attendance on the unattractive Miss Mitsand. "Let me see you home, Miss Faunthorpe. I shall be delighted." Sibyl runs away to put on her bonnet, and the guests issue forth in a bevy. Dr. Mitsand's useful brougham is waiting. The others walk home in the tranquil, perfumed air. Fred offers his arm, which Sibyl accepts with the infinite ease of indifference. Mr. and Mrs. Groshen make themselves agreeable by walking on briskly. "Isn't it a lovely night?" gasped Fred rapturously. "Yes, it's very fine. We generally have nice evenings in June." "Yes," replies Fred, after judicious consideration, "I think we do. Nice long evenings, at any rate. The 21st being the longest day, of course, is a reason. Nice month for races, too. But rather rainy sometimes, don't you think?" Sibyl concedes the point. "I remember one wet June, poured all the month. Regular cats and dogs. The racecourse was a morass. Of course, the heaviest timbered horse won. Here we are, I declare, close to Lancaster Lodge. How I wish it was further off." "Not very flattering to me to wish us less near neighbours," says Sibyl, laughing. "Oh, come now, Miss Faunthorpe, you know I don't mean that. But just for to-night, for the sake of prolonging this delightful walk." "Don't talk nonsense, please," says Sibyl, "and be kind enough to ring the bell." They are standing at the gate by this time, and Fred lingers, as if loth to perform that necessary duty. He rings, and the lodge-keeper opens the side gate. Sibyl offers Mr. Stormont her hand on the threshold, but gives him no invitation to enter the domain. "Good night," she says, and then cries suddenly, "Do you hear that?" It is a most melodious jug-jugging from a dark clump of chestnuts near the gate. "I hear something chirruping," replies Fred dubiously. "It's the nightingale. It sings every night just at this time. Isn't it exquisite?" "Rather throaty," says Fred. "Good night," repeats Sibyl, shutting the gate in his face. "Horrid young man!" she ejaculates. How dark, cool, and silent, save for those nightingales, the grounds are to-night. She is in no hurry to go into the house. The dewy turf, the tall black trees standing out against a sky of mixed light and colour, the moon rising grandly above the elms yonder, just where the Lancaster Lodge grounds meet the edge of Redcastle Park. Sir John Boldero's domain, all is beautiful. Sibyl walks slowly along the shrubberied drive, and round to the lawn behind the house, that wide sweep of velvet grass upon which she and her uncle spend the summer afternoons. Mr. Trenchard's study is on this side of the house. The lighted windows inform Sibyl that he has not yet retired for the night. The study opens on the lawn by a half-glass door. She can go into the house this way, and surprise her forgetful uncle by her return, and tell him all about her day, about Sir Wilford Cardonnel's attentions, of which she is proud. She thinks it will please her uncle to know that one of the magnates of the land has admired her. She goes towards this glass door, but makes a dead stop before one of the study windows, startled by what she sees there. It is nothing very remarkable, perhaps, at the first showing, only Uncle Stephen and a stranger. But the stranger is no ordinary person, and there is that in Stephen Trenchard's face which makes the scene remarkable. The lamp burns brightly on the official-looking table, which is spread with papers, formidable-looking papers, bristling with figures ruled with red ink. They are laid open, as if for inspection, and among them lies an open ledger. Sibyl has no experience which can teach her the exact nature of these papers, but she knows instinctively that they must have some relation to commerce. Stephen Trenchard's face is black as thunder. His left hand lies on that open ledger. With the right he points to a column of figures, running his square forefinger down the column with a vicious dig of the nail here and there, as much as to say, "Look at that, sir, and at that, and what do you say to that?" The stranger stands at Mr. Trenchard's elbow. He is a foreigner, an Oriental, Sibyl thinks. though his plain and faultless clothes are perfectly English. He has a dark olive skin, eyes black as night, an aquiline nose, a narrow oval face, and silky blue-black hair. He is something less than the middle height, stout and sleek. His lips move softly, and his plump yellow hand seems to expostulate as Stephen Trenchard scowls at the figures. "Who can he be?" wonders Sibyl, abandoning all intention of seeing her uncle to-night. "Some Indian friend of Uncle Stephen's, I suppose. But what can all those papers mean? And why does Uncle Stephen look so angry? He looked just like that when he spoke of Philip Secretan." She goes round to the front of the house. The hall door is open, and the footman is airing himself on the threshold, listening to the nightingales. "Why wasn't the carriage sent for me?" asks Sibyl. "Indeed, ma'am, I don't know. Was it ordered?" "I suppose so. Mr. Trenchard said he would send it." "I'm afraid master must have forgotten it, ma'am. I didn't take no message to the coachman. Perhaps it was the gentleman coming to see him that put it out of his mind." "I suppose so. Who is the gentleman, do you know?" "No, ma'am. There was no name given. The gentleman came after dinner, about 9 o'clock. He came from London, I believe. The London train hadn't been long in when he came, and he's been with Mr. Trenchard ever since." "Is he going to stay here to-night?" "I don't know, ma'am. There's been nothing said. But Mrs. Skinner had the blue room got ready, in case it should be wanted, as a premonitory measure." Sibyl yawns languidly, and goes upstairs to her own room, puzzled, but not seriously disturbed. The stranger has come on some business errand, evidently. She knows that her uncle's temper is not particularly placid, and concludes that he has been irritated by some vexation of a commercial character. Yet she cannot understand how this can be, since she has been taught to believe Mr. Trenchard has retired from business. Curiosity would impel her to await the stranger's departure in the drawing-room, or to discover whether he is to remain for the night. But she does not care to encounter her uncle in his present temper, and he would doubtless be offended by anything that could look like espionage. It is nearly midnight when she goes to her room. Her windows open on the garden, and are above those of the study. She seats herself by an open window, and looks out into the cool, shadowy garden. Presently she hears a voice raised in anger. Her uncle's voice, she knows, but the stranger's tones never reach her ear. "His voice is like his looks, I dare say," she thinks, "soft and silky and cunning. I shouldn't think he was the kind of man Uncle Trenchard would trust." She wastes more than an hour in undressing, brushing her hair, putting away her finery. The clock strikes 1, but those lighted windows still shine upon the dark turf below. "What a long interview," she thinks. "This Indian gentleman must surely be going to stay all night. He would never leave the house at such an hour as this." She falls asleep at last, worn out by the fatigues of the day, but at the last moment hears that angry voice of her uncle's suddenly raised in a gust of passion. She wakes next morning with an uneasy sense of something having gone wrong, but it is some moments before that scene in the room beneath flashes back upon her. "Who can that man be?" she asks herself again. "And why was Uncle Trenchard so angry? Some Indian merchant, perhaps, to whom he has lent money. The loss of a few thousands ought not to make him so angry. It must be like a drop in the ocean compared with his immense wealth. But then I know he is fond of money, and that it pains him to part even with a 10-pound note." She dresses and goes down to the dining-room, looking as fresh as the newly opened roses to which the nightingale sings at sundown. Mr. Trenchard is in his accustomed seat, the big crimson morocco armchair drawn into the bay window. The sashes are up, and the sweet morning air comes in across the flower beds. 8 o'clock is the hour for breakfast, winter and summer, at Lancaster Lodge, and unpunctuality is little less than a crime in the eyes of Stephen Trenchard, who is usually dressed in his blue frock coat and pankeen waistcoat and trousers by 6, and prowling about the grounds to the discomfiture of his gardeners. He is a shade paler than usual, and has purple shadows under his eyes. His hand shakes a little, Sibyl thinks, as he turns the leaves of the Manchester Daily, which he reads every morning before breakfast. The face he turns to her as she bends over him to administer her morning kiss has an old and wan look in the sunshine. Can it be that Mrs. Stormont is right, and that Stephen Trenchard is breaking up? There are no early prayers at Lancaster Lodge. Mr. Trenchard has his ideas upon religion, and his own particular creed by which he is to stand or fall, no doubt. But whatever these are, he keeps them strictly to himself. He never goes to church, a neglect of duty which in a person of Mr. Trenchard's consequence Redcastle regards as an eccentricity, but which would make a social outlaw of a small butcher or baker. He has no objection to Sibyl's attendance at the Minster, where she exhibits the latest fashions on Sunday mornings. He is no declared infidel. He simply ignores religion as a thing he has been able to dispense with all his life. Sibyl takes her place before the silver urn and begins the business of tea-making. Mr. Trenchard drinks green tea unmixed with black, and is very particular about the preparation of the beverage. Marion has never succeeded in pleasing him in this matter. Sibyl has never failed. "You are looking so tired this morning, dear uncle," she says, in her soft, winning voice. "You were up very late last night, were you not?" "How do you know that? You were in bed, I suppose?" "Not till 12 o'clock. I stayed rather late at the Stormonts, thinking you would send the carriage for me." "The carriage. Ah, to be sure. I forgot." "It didn't matter in the least. I walked home. That horrid Fred brought me. Such a lovely night. The walk would have been delightful with any one else." "Ah, you don't like young Stormont," says Mr. Trenchard, looking sharply at her. "I'm glad of it, child. He's a genteel pauper at best. You must marry some one better than that." Sibyl pales at the mention of marriage. "I don't mean to marry at all, uncle. I'm much happier as I am with you." "Stuff and nonsense, my dear. Marriage is a woman's mission, and with your pretty face you are sure to get a rich husband." "You wouldn't have me marry for money, Uncle Trenchard?" cries Sibyl with a horrified look. Here is this old man rolling in wealth, and yet counselling a mercenary marriage. "I wouldn't have you marry without money. You are no girl to play at love in a cottage. That's a game you'd soon grow tired of." Sibyl starts as if she had been stung. "Don't talk of marriage, Uncle Trenchard. The subject is hateful to me. There is no one in Redcastle that I care for,